Hello and welcome to Twist List. Today we are looking at 10 insanely daring historical air raids. Flying military airplanes is a dangerous and terrifying job. During times of war, many brave aviators have conducted daring raids against insane odds. Here are 10 of the most daring raids in history and the stories of the crews who flew them. Number 8 on our list is 8. In the late 1970s, the Iraqi government purchased a nuclear reactor from the French. While both countries claimed that the reactor was purely for scientific research, Israel was more suspicious. Having a nuclear reactor in the region was a big concern. Early 1980s intelligence estimates believed that Iraq would have nuclear weapons within the decade. Quickly, the Israelis attempted to seek a diplomatic solution to their problem by trying to convince European powers to stop funding the reactor. Diplomacy failed, so the Israeli military began to plan a daring strike against the reactor without consulting other nations. Israel would use US-built F-16s and F-15s for the attack. Engineers stripped down 8 F-16s to carry as many munitions as possible. The F-15s would provide air support. Overall, the mission would require the jets to fly 1,000 kilometers, 600 miles, over 3 enemy countries. For most of the mission, the fighters would fly only 46 meters, 150 feet, off the ground. On June 7, 1981, the attack force took off. Their flight took them over Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and then Iraq. Careful planning gave the fighters a path that avoided ground-based radar and enemy airfields. Even though the planes were so close to the ground, nobody knew they were coming until they got to Iraq. King Hussein of Jordan was visiting Iraq that day and saw the low-flying jets screaming overhead. He quickly tried to get a warning to the Iraqi military, but it was too late. The F-16s dropped their bombs and annihilated the reactor. They then climbed to 12,000 meters, 40,000 feet, flew over Jordan, and returned home. The reactor was gone, which stopped any hopes that Iraq had number 7 power weapons. 7. One of the most famous air raids conducted by the United States during World War II, the Doolittle Raid is a mission that most people have heard of but don't realize how absolutely insane it was. The raid was a retribution for the attack on Pearl Harbor, which brought the U.S. into World War II. Military planners wanted to conduct a retaliatory air raid, but the only problem was that they didn't have airplanes with a long enough range to hit the Japanese home islands. Hotshot pilot Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle had an idea: launch ground-based medium bombers from a carrier on a one-way strike over Japan. Training of volunteer bomber crews started immediately. The B-25 bombers used for the raid usually needed 360 meters, 1,200 feet, of runway distance, but the aircraft carrier USS Hornet only had a 150-meter, 500 feet, deck. Eventually, the crews figured out how to take off in that distance. To make it work, the B-25s had to cut as much weight as possible. All unnecessary equipment left out of the planes. On April 18, 1942, the mission commenced earlier than expected. The carrier group made contact with Japanese picket ships. Although escort ships sunk the Japanese pickets, the surprise was lost. The mission launched 10 hours earlier than expected and 270 kilometers, 170 miles, further away from Japan than planned. Doolittle's B-25 took off first. His bomber's job was to fly alone over Tokyo and mark the targets with incendiary bombs. An hour after Doolittle left, 15 other bombers took off, each barely making it off the aircraft carrier. Roaring in at 600 meters, 2,000 feet, the bombers attacked Japanese industrial targets. After they dropped their bombs, the B-25s were too fast for intercepting Japanese fighters to catch them. 11. Then came the really dangerous part: landing in Japanese-occupied China. Most crews touched down in China and met up with local resistance leaders. One crew landed in the Soviet Union and got interned. 8 crew members were captured by the Japanese,
Number 6 on the
and
list
3 were
is
executed.
6.
Overall,
Often forgot
the mission did minimal
to
damage,
Pearl Harbor,
but it boosted
sinking
U.S.
of 2
morale
British
while crushing the
battleships,
Japanese
the Prince of
leadership.
Wales and the Repulse,
Was the other major Japanese air raid in December 1941. That month, the British Force Z started to sail toward Malaya to stop a Japanese invasion fleet. However, the force's commanders made terrible tactical choices. They elected to sail without air cover of any kind so they could have complete radio silence. This fateful decision doomed the fleet. Although they were sailing without air cover, the sailors were confident in the ship's anti-aircraft defenses. Japanese forces spotted Force Z and quickly made plans to attack. Unlike Pearl Harbor, this attack would be much more difficult, since the ships could maneuver in open water. Never before had the Japanese conducted a bombing attack on ships in open water. To make sure that the ships were hit, The Japanese launched 85 aircraft to attack the force. GEM medium bombers carried out the main thrust of the attack, even though they weren't specifically designed for attacking battleships. On the first attack run, the bombers hit the support ships with armor-piercing bombs but failed to sink them. However, the second wave of GEMs were carrying torpedoes. These bombers came in at extremely low altitude, flying straight into British anti-aircraft fire, as was necessary for a torpedo bomber collapse. Wave after wave came in, and eventually, both the Prince of Wales and the Repulse took 4 torpedoes each, sinking them. Even though the Japanese pilots had never conducted an attack like that, they were extremely successful. Only 18 Japanese aviators were lost, while 840 British sailors died. The fifth spot on the list is occupied by Prince of Wales. In 1967, Israel's neighbors began to build up their militaries to attack the small state. Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan were the primary allies against Israel. Each had a sizable air force that could decimate the Israeli forces quickly. With Israel facing a war against several countries, military planners realized that the only way to turn the upcoming conflict in their favor was to conduct a preemptive airstrike against their enemies' combined air forces. Known as Operation Focus, this airstrike was one of the biggest in recent history. Israeli pilots mostly flew French Mirage fighter planes loaded with bombs. Nearly 200 aircraft lifted off on June 5. This huge strike force constituted the majority of the Israeli Air Force. Only a few interceptors stayed behind to patrol friendly airspace. It was quite literally an all-or-nothing attack. On the first wave, the Israeli pilots hit 11 Egyptian bases, catching most of the Egyptian airplanes on the ground, unable to respond to the attack. After the first wave, the Israeli pilots returned to base and were reloaded with bombs, taking off again in under 10 minutes for the next wave. When the second wave was successful, the pilots conducted one more attack, once again reloading and refueling in less than 10 minutes. All of these attacks occurred in the space of 3 hours. In the end, 500 Egyptian, Syrian, Iraqi, and Jordanian planes lay burning on the ground, decimated by the Israeli strikes. Israel took minimal losses of only 19 airplanes. With the coalition air force destroyed, Israel maintained air superiority for the rest of the Six-Day War. Number 4 on the list is Repulse. As World War II dragged on, the Royal Air Force became more bold in their attacks on Germany. Before 1943, the RAF was unable to bomb Berlin due to a lack of suitable aircraft as well as the city's strong anti-aircraft defenses. By 1943, however, the Nazi forces were weaker, and the British had a new bomber. The de Havilland Mosquito was a beautiful plane made of wood. The plywood bomber was absurdly fast, capable of outrunning any German interceptor. They were perfect for the opening bombing raids on Berlin. On January 30, the Nazis were preparing for a big event celebrating 10 years since Hitler came to power. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels and Luftwaffe head Hermann Göring planned to deliver celebratory speeches over the radio. Allied intelligence learned exactly what time the two men would be delivering their speeches and planned to disrupt them with a mosquito attack. At 11 a.m., Göring got up to give his speech, only to find bombs falling from overhead. The first mosquito element successfully bombed the area in which Göring was giving his speech, and the Luftwaffe head was unable to take the lectern for an hour after the attack. He was said to have been boiling with rage and humiliation. 5 hours later, Goebbels got ready to give his speech, only to be disrupted by another mosquito attack right as he was starting. Only 6 aircraft conducted the attacks, but they managed to be a huge embarrassment to the Nazi leadership. Later that night, the first British bombing raid using radar successfully took place. These cheeky missions started the 2-year bombing campaign against the German capital. At the third place we have Operation Focus. Another amazing raid conducted by mosquito bombers was Operation Jericho, the attack on Amiens prison. The Nazi prison was known to hold 700 Allied aviators and French resistance operatives. The prison had high walls and guard shacks, which made it impossible to attack from the ground. Bombers were the only option. But since there were prisoners inside, the bombers couldn't simply blow up the buildings. Military engineers developed precision bombs that could be dropped from low altitude and use delayed charges to blow up the walls of the prison without killing the inmates. In theory, the destroyed walls would allow prisoners to escape out into the countryside. With the operation planned for February 1944, the mission planners had to wait for the winter weather to clear up. Day after day passed of bad weather until the February 18th, when they decided to launch the strike regardless of the weather. 18 mosquitoes took off into terrible weather, which forced some members of the strike force to turn back. However, enough made it to the target to start the attack. Some mosquitoes dropped bombs on the guard housing, while others used their special bombs to destroy the walls, all while flying only 15 meters, 50 feet, off the ground. Bombardiers needed absurdly precise aim to not hurt the prisoners. Well-placed strikes breached the walls, but some prisoners were caught in the explosions. Nevertheless, many prisoners escaped through the breached walls. Oddly, this mission is quite controversial. Historians debate whether the prisoners were actually in danger while in the prison and question the usefulness of the attack. Still, the idea of bomber planes flying barely above the ground to knock holes in walls is pretty impressive. At the second spot is the 1943 mosquito raid of Berlin. Germany's Ruhr Valley was heavily industrialized during the war and was a main source of the country's war-making ability. There were several large dams that provided hydroelectric power for factories. British planners knew that they needed to come up with a way to destroy the dams, but they realized that traditional bombing raids would take a huge amount of bombers and would be extremely dangerous for pilots. Engineer Barnes Wallis had a different idea. Wallis developed a strange bouncing bomb. The cylindrical bomb was spun right before being dropped by Lancaster bombers. When the spinning cylinder impacted the river surface, it would bounce on the water, crash into the dam, and then sink to the river floor, where it would explode. With this technique, the bomb would avoid the anti-torpedo nets defending the dams and cause maximum damage by hitting their bases. To make it work, the Lancaster crews would need to fly extremely low and to drop their bombs at the right time. Wallis developed a special targeting device shaped like a V. The bombardier would look down the V while the bomber approached the dam. When the 2 points of the V lined up with the towers on the dam, the bombardier would drop the bouncing bomb. Special spotlights on the bottom of the bombers told the pilot how high he was. When the spotlights touched on the ground, he was at the ideal height of 18 meters, 60 feet. On the night of May 16, 1943, 19 Lancaster bombers from the No. 617 Squadron took off to conduct the attack. From the beginning, the raid was incredibly dangerous. To avoid radar and flak, the bombers flew low over the English Channel and over the European coast. And finally, the force split into two attack waves to hit the Jericho, but they began to lose planes to both the oil fields of flying before they even reached the target. Accounted for 30% of Axis oil production. Most of the planes made it and conducted their bombing runs, that taking the oil fields out would significantly cripple the Axis war effort in Europe. So they hatched a plan in 1943 for the United States Ninth Air Force to conduct a daring mission to destroy the people on the ground. The only problem was that most prisoners had one of the best air defense grids in Europe. 8 of the 19 aircraft planners realized that the bombers would have to fly at extremely low altitude to get under the radar coverage, was known as that would expose them to the countless anti-aircraft guns around the oil fields. Still, it was a risk that the Americans were willing to take, and they committed 178 bombers in 5 strike waves, the largest strike up to that time. All of the airplanes were B-24 Liberator bombers, big 4-engine heavy bombers designed for high-altitude missions. Flying from Benghazi, Libya, the 5 strike waves took off on August 1. The plan was for all 5 groups to attack at the same time, but issues quickly arose. In one group, a bomber dropped into the sea, almost causing a mid-air collision. In other groups, the pilots used the wrong power settings for their engines and fell behind. What was once a cohesive strike force became a strung-out formation of bombers. The mission was further exasperated by navigational issues. Worse still, the Germans knew they were coming. They alerted their defense grid and launched 200 fighters to meet the American bombers. The first wave of attack commenced with 2 groups swooping down at low altitude to hit the oil fields. While they flew away from the fields, the other groups started their attacks, having to fly through smoke and fire to find alternate targets, all while dodging alerted German defenses. Fact.
The
Bombers
Irish may
flew
have
so low that
discovered
they were
America
blowing
first.
thatch roofs off
Some
houses
say
and dueling
Christopher
with German
Columbus was
flak
the first to
emplacements.
discover
The scattered
America.
American
As the
emperors
phone
tried to
goes, in
make their way home to
1492,
Benghazi, but
Columbus
many had to
sailed the
find
ocean
alternate
blue.
bases or try
Some
to seek
suggest that the
sanctuary in
first
neutral
to discover
Turkey.
America
In the
were
end,
the
a
Vikings,
huge number
or
of the
perhaps the
planes were lost.
Chinese. But
In
there
all,
is another legend
310
in
airmen
regards
died,
to which
and
country
108
first
were taken
sailed to the
prisoner.
Americas.
Within a few
According
months,
to one
the oil
legend,
fields were
an
back at
Irish
normal
monk
production
called Saint
capacity.
Brendan set
The
out
mission
on an
was a failure,
expedition to
but it
find
was the most
paradise,
insane
and
raid
after 7
conducted by
years
the United
discovered an
States during
island
World
that
War
was so
II.
large that even after 40 days they could not reach the far shore. The monks returned home with the news. This voyage was said to be undertaken in the 6th century, which is much earlier than many of the other first discoveries of America. It should be clear, of course, that this legend has not been proven. And finally, at number 1, Saint Patrick. Fact: Saint Patrick was not actually Irish. Saint Patrick is well known for being the patron saint of Ireland and having a day named for him that most of the world uses as an excuse to get incredibly drunk. However, Saint Patrick, despite popular belief, was not actually Irish. Saint Patrick was the son of Romans who were living in Britain. Legend says he was kidnapped and taken as a slave to the Emerald Isle where he helped herd sheep. However, even more interesting is a recent study performed by Cambridge University that suggests a completely different take on the popular legend. According to the study, he may actually have gone to Ireland of his own accord and sold slaves himself so that he wouldn't have to be drafted into a job as a tax collector for the Romans.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, then please hit the subscribe button.